It's the Apollo class, it's the Apollo class, Apollo class, Apollo class, Apollo class, Apollo class, Apollo class. Apollo class. They are the Apollo class. There is literally no other way of describing them, because this is sort of the equivalent program to the Constellation class frigates, the Oliver Hazard Perry class frigates, the pretty much every equivalent version by a major power to churn out an acceptable level of capability that it counts as a first line combatant, but cheap enough they can build it in quantity. This is the Apollo class. They are special, really special, and I always have a bit of a soft spot for them. I'm not really sure why it comes through. They're this sort of little class that I sort of look at and go, there are so many reasons I shouldn't be that keen on you. There's the fact that you are ditchy. You're 3,600 tons. The fact that, literally the Pearl class cruiser and things before that are not much of a less capability than this is. But still, for some reason, these little cruisers, these little ships that are just these really small things that wander around the world, they're 3,700 tons, or 3,600 long tons. They wander all over the place. They turn up in all sorts of random places, and you can just see them being sort of this task group ship, this task force ship, and you can, they're just so ubiquitously useful. And I just like them. And they have an interesting story. And there's a reason I have a question mark by the 1890. Right. So, normally we date the Apollo class till 1890, right? Because we always date ships by the year they're launched. There's a problem, though. Okay? The Andromache, the Latona, the Melampus, the Naid, the Sibyl, the Terpsichore, the Thetis, the Peak, and the Sirius and the Sirius are all launched in 1890. However, Apollo herself isn't launched till 1891. February 1891, but 1891. So, just a small issue with the reality that was sort of, how do I put this politely, their service entry. Apollo, the class entered service in 1890, that's when they're launched. But Apollo herself is 1891, so it's worthy of a question mark. So, they're a product of the Naval Defence Act of 1899, which is a fun piece of history, and which I have done a video about in the past. I have done actually a couple of videos about it. I've done, goodness gracious me, live, and about 4 episodes of a long patrol about it. It was Patreon 14. It was back, one of the original Patreon videos. One of the first ones. 14 must have been, within the first year. And to summarise it, because I went into far longer detail, it's sometimes held up as a failure and sometimes held up as a success. It can be said to be a success because it deters conflict and manages to put the British in a position whereby they could build up for the naval deterrence, and had pretty much won the naval race before World War I began. They won the naval race by 1912, 1913. But the thing is, it's basically a formal adoption of two-power standard. Now, one of the problems you have when you start talking about a naval race is people immediately go, well, Britain's building this to build up to match France and Russia. Does Britain end up going to war with France and Russia in between 1889 and the end of World War One? No. Then they do have some interesting points with Soviet Russia, or rather the Reds versus the Whites, but that's interfering in a civil war in Russia. And France, well, they don't end up fighting them or attacking them until Mirza al-Kabir, which of course is brought about by a failure of communication at many levels. And before people start thinking I'm just talking about Mirza al-Kabir, no, I'm talking about the high command of France not telling the British what they were actually doing, so they caught the British on the hop. And the British had been thinking the French were going to ally with them and were going to carry on fighting, and that's why they'd sent gold and things to Canada and all this sort of stuff, and then suddenly announcing that they weren't, and causing a unsurprising knee-jerk reaction. So, on those grounds, it could be said that it actually worked. But of course, it does lead to the issues with Germany, to an extent, because Germany starts to build up to try and, risk fleets, build themselves up to be strong enough that the British will not want to fight them. The British are now locked into a two-power standard. So they're also building up, and this leads to competition. But why would the French and the Russians building up in the first place? Well, the French were building up because of the Italians. And the Russians were building up, believe it or not, because of, to an extent, Japan's construction, but also to an extent their own status and their own recovery and their own seeking for aggrandizement and to unify their nation. And there's all sorts of nations start building navies at this point, and there is to an extent an element of competition going on, but also there's an element of Britain going, well, if Britain didn't build up their navy, they'd be pretty much surrendering their status as the preeminent naval power without a fight. And they're not going to do that because if you consider Britain's global position, their economic position depends largely on their status at this time. And that status comes from having the world's preeminent navy. Or at least being perceived to have the world's preeminent navy. So they don't really have much of a choice. And they set up this sort of long-term funding scheme, and then there's another one that comes after it, because people are still building. And it's one of the things with procurement and deterrence by procurement. There is a perception in some circles that, well, if we start procuring, victory is them stopping procuring. It isn't. The only way you can stop a nation state from procuring arms and weapons is by waging war on it. That's the only way you can do it. So procurement is a deterrent. Procurement is not going to stop them procuring. What you have to judge the procurement deterrence by is by the diplomatic context of what happens afterwards and how things relate. Interesting enough, the Naval Defence Act of 1899, well, it leads the British to being procuring 8 first-class battleships, 2 second-class battleships, 9 first-class cruisers, 29 second-class cruisers, of which 21 are Apollo class. "21 are Apollo class. The remaining 8 are Astrea class, which are basically modified Apollos. And then 4 third-class cruisers, which are Pearls from memory, and 18 torpedo gunboats, which pretty much morph into torpedo boat destroyers by the second wave. Well, let's say it gets interesting. By this act, we can ask, does Britain end up war with France? No. Does it end up war with Russia? No. It comes close. But really, it doesn't even end up at war with Germany. If we consider that the Germans, it's not a failure of the naval diplomacy, etc. Well, it is a failure of naval diplomacy, but it's not a failure of the procurement. The Germans took the government's words, and especially the Kaiser in this, took the government's words, the king's words, and the fact that the fleet hadn't been mobilised and hadn't been aggressively positioned as a sign that the British were really not keen on backing up the French. And there's also the signaling of the fact that that was the Entente Cordiale. It was the Entente, not alliance. It was an Entente, an understanding, a friendship, not an alliance. Important words for the British public, important words for the opposition, important words for British geopolitical manoeuvring. But unfortunately, words have meaning in diplomacy, and the more fragile sounding an alliance or agreement, the more affirmative you have to be in your actions in order to support it and make it look strong and real. I'm not saying that a heavy British mobilisation would have prevented World War One. It best would have delayed it, at best. Might have bordered a couple more years. But the trouble is, it's the personalities you're dealing with that makes World War One happen. That's the problem. You've got too many theories and too many egos. You've got the risk fleet theory, you've got the Juno Cole for naval terms. You've got all sorts of things being built and discussed. You've got all sorts of technology going on which people don't really understand how it's changing things. And people talk about revolutions of warfare and the changes of warfare at this point. One of the things you have to remember is that in this period, it's still very much, you could have taken a senior officer, a commodore or admiral from 1805 and put them in charge of a squadron in 1890, and whilst they wouldn't have necessarily understood the magic which was propelling them forward, the windless ships, although they'd probably quickly got it and quickly grasped it, they would have been able to command and lead a battle. Which is a scary thing to think, really. This, of course, is a raw sovereign class. In other videos, I have talked about the current debates going on about what these battleships should be called, and my thing would be, if you're going to have a kind of a phrase, and you don't want to call them pre-dreadnoughts, and of course they're not the ironclads, I would say you could go a long way worse than calling them sovereign battleships. You could go a long way worse than calling them sovereign battleships. I'm not sure if other historians would pick it up, but I would say these set the tone and the standard for a lot of what was constructed. So we have second-class cruisers. Let's go back to this again. There are less first-class cruisers than there are combined total battleships. 8 first-class battleships, 2 second-class battleships. That's basically battleships for foreign stations. They're going to be easy to look after. But the real meat of this force are these 29 second-class cruisers. So, this is them. They have simple lines. They look, to an extent, like an improvement of the Elswick sort of style ships. And they are. They are in many regards an improvement of the Elswick ships. And it's unsurprising that Sirius and Spartan, of this class, are built at Armstrong Mitchell in Elswick. Yes, two of them are actually Elswick cruisers. Well, they get built in Poplar, in Hepburn, Clydebank, Devonport, Sheerness Dockyard, one of the Royal Navy stations. They get built by London and Glasgow shipbuilding. They built Indefatigable, Intrepid, Infinemia. They are some really cool ships. And of course, there's one of the Yarrow built ones, Rainbow, goes on to become HMCS Rainbow. But what are they? What is a second class cruiser? Well, let's consider it. 3,600 long tons, as I said, 3,700 tons in total. 96 metres long, 13.26 metres beam, draft 5.3 metres. Power came from 5 boilers supplying 2 triple expansion engines, driving 2 shafts with 7,000 indicated horsepower at natural draft, 9,000 indicated horsepower at forced draft, top speed of 19.75 knots, or a range of 8,000 nautical miles at 10 knots. Complement between 273 and 300 officers and men. Armament: 2 6-inch quick-firing guns, they're fore and aft, 6 quick-firing 4.7-inch guns, 8 6-pounder guns, 2 to 4 14-inch torpedo tubes. It depends on the exact ship, but it seems that they start very quickly start increasing the number of torpedoes carried. It's considered useful to have them. They have an armour deck of between 1 1/4 and 2 inches thick, conning tower of 3 inches thick, gun shields 4 1/2 inches thick, and an engine hatch which was 5 inches thick, which I just love. Yes, we have a hatch above the engine. Yeah, that's 5 inches thick. It's about as thick as we can make it. It works. In other words, this little ship is small, but it's protected enough to make it not necessarily the easiest and quickest thing you're going to fight. In fact, it's got enough there that if there's a couple of them, you're going to be in trouble. Very realistically, the American Navy is very, very lucky that there weren't more vessels like this manned and crewed and trained up as they should have been, to get most of them, in service with the Spanish fleet in 1899. Because they could have thrown a few spanners in the work. Yes, the US ships would have been undoubtedly bigger and able to overwhelm them, but they could also, with their torpedoes and their guns and their armour and the survivability, and you can see some of the armour spread if you look at this where this design is shaped, would have made them somewhat of a more difficult prospect than the unprotected cruisers which the Americans found made up the bulk of the Spanish forces. And that's the point, really, for the British. If we go back to this, let's say you have one of these lovely, beautiful things turned up on station. On its own, it is a threat. But it's a threat you can manage. Manage to send along 3 of these, which, considering you're building 29 of them for building 8 first-class battleships and 2 second-class battleships, and suddenly you're dealing with a force which is a far more difficult prospect. We're talking about a force which has actual capabilities to cause significant damage. And that's a problem. That's a problem because, let's say you send in some prime units to take on this. Well, if it's on its own, they might overwhelm it, but if they've got to take out all these first, then that allows that to deal with one at a time. And maybe you win, but you're not going to win quickly, and if this takes out whatever you sent it to take on it, then it can then start double teaming whatever's still fighting these. And yes, the Royal Navy will happily lose a few of these. They prefer not to lose any ships or any crew, but if their choice is to lose a battle or win a battle, and losing these versus losing one of these, then that's what the second class cruisers are for. As you can see, 6-pounders are spread around nicely to provide decent coverage and protection against small torpedo boats. The 4.7-inch guns also provide decent protection against those, but there's also a slight interesting thing in that you can, in theory, although not in practice, possibly arrange it so you could get two forward 4.7-inch guns to also cover forward, and your two aft 4.7-inch guns to also cover a bit aft. It's actually more difficult than it looks, but in theory they do have significant arcs, and crews were known to adapt them in circumstances, although it wasn't particularly easy. As you can see when you look at this picture, it can look easier than it actually is. Anyway, this is HMS Andromache. And Andromache is, what can I say? Namesake is the wife of Hector, daughter of Etienne, and sister of Podes, i.e. it is a classical Greek name. She was built at Chatham Dockyard. She was president of Naval Review in June 1897, and in the celebration of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. In 1900, she and Apollo were transferred from the Medway to Devonport Fleet Reserve, and Andromache was pretty much, other than for exercises, fleet manoeuvres, was unemployed from being built. In 1900, orders from Devonport ordered for mobilisation to take place in July. This was in June 1900, 27th of June and 10th of July. A Commander Francis Allen Richard Bowles was appointed to command in April 1902, and in June that year she was reported to serve as the Naval Reserve drill ship at North Shields. She then took part in the Fleet Review at Spithead for the coronation of King Edward VII. And in February 1908, the torpedo gunboat Leda collided with Andromache in Harwich Harbour, and Leda had to be beached to avoid sinking. In 1909, she was converted to a mine layer at Chatham Dockyard, and she took part in naval exercises off the east coast of Britain in July-August 1910. Unfortunately, on the night of the 1st of August, the steamship Neapolitan Prince, which had been employed as a transport during the exercise, collided with Andromache on leaving Harwich Harbour. Seems to be Harwich Harbour is not a positive place for Andromache. This crushed boats and davits on Andromache's starboard side. In August 1914, she joined the Mine-Land Squadron, but was soon reduced to harbour duties, as it was felt she was more useful in that role. She cost £186,234 to be built at Chatham Dockyard. She's a good little ship. And a useful one. Apollo, for whom the class is named. Now, originally, she was put under the command of Captain Richard Poor. Later, came under the command of George Anson Primrose in 1893, who would, of course, go on to become a Vice Admiral. She then went into reserve, then took part in the Diamond Jubilee in 1897. As mentioned, transferred back to reserve in 1900. In February 1900, she's moved from Chatham to Devonport, took part in the Fleet Review Spithead in 1902 for King Edward VII's coronation. 1909, converted into a mine layer. Served in this role in the first year of World War I. And then she and a remaining of her sisters formed the squadron operating from Dover in Nore. Disarmed in 1915 and seems to be relegated to secondary roles. Arthur Wood captaining her between 1917 and 1919. He goes on to become a Rear Admiral. So that suggests she's probably doing something. And she's broken up in 1920. She's a fun ship. HMS Latona. Right. She's interesting as well. Now, she's built by Vickers at their naval construction yard in Barrow-in-Furness. Launched in May 1890 and completed in April 1891. In a kind of run-of-the-mill thing you're going to hear from me a lot, she took part in the Spithead Review for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. It's a big surprise. They seem to have turned out every single ship that floated for that Jubilee Review. It's amazing. Then she went into the West Indies under Captain Baines, returned to Portsmouth from Bermuda in January 1900 with the paid-off crew of HMS Indefatigable aboard. Indefatigable is, of course, another of her sisters. It's amazing how many of the class's names turn up later in World War II as various larger cruisers and aircraft carriers' names. During the tour, she had actually managed to rescue 16 crew from the bark Oxford when she found it in distress, and to save them. So she'd acted as a lifeboat. Paid off Portsmouth in February 1900. Then in June 1900, she was ordered to be specially commissioned for naval mobilization to take place in July. In 1902, she was refitted to become a depot ship, supply depot ship, for submarines at Portsmouth. This would entail the crew of the boats living in water. And she was commissioned on the 14th of October 1902 by the then Captain Reginald Bacon, the inspecting captain of submarines, who basically took over as her commanding officer for a while. She was then recommissioned at Chatham on the 1st of June 1908 and converted to a mine layer in 1910. In 1913, she was part of the mine layer squadron of the 2nd Fleet, and between the 1st and 7th of January 1916, she laid mines between Cape Alanguli and Apostula Island. Between 30 and 40 December 1916, officers from the ship were involved in an incident with aircraft coming from, well, Cumcale, which is an interesting point. This is a little quote I found from the Naval Review, but it seems to be an interesting one from the Naval Review, and I haven't really found more than just that note about that incident in both a book and, strangely enough, those beautiful denizens of Wikipedia who often have these wonderful sources cited. And everyone just talking about Naval Review, and it seems to be behind a paywall of Naval Reviews. So, not sure what that was about. Or probably, I think I do know what it's about because of my experience looking at naval aviation, but I think it's an incident which I call something different. But I won't know until I manage to get through that paywall. Anyway, Latona was paid off in December 1918 at Malta. Then in 1919, she was placed on harbour duties, and she was sold on 22nd December 1920. Officers in charge for include Henry Copton Anderson Baines, Hugh Thomas Hibbett, Alexander Farrington, James Uhtred Ferry, Rudolph Miles Burminster, Thomas Hector Molesworth Maurice, and Cecil Vivian Usborne. That is one interesting list of names. Definitely an interesting list of names. HMS Melampus. She's a special ship. They're all special ships. They're all cool to me. I don't know what it is about this class. As I said, something about them just makes me smile. Now, she was originally ordered and to be built for the Greek Navy. However, the Greek Navy didn't want. The Greeks ended up not being able to pay for her, and so the British said, "Well, we'll just lump her into the buy of Apollos we're already buying." In 1891, the Prince George of Wales, the future King George V, was promoted to commander in 1891, and he assumed command of Melampus. He didn't relinquish his post until under much sufferance in January 1892, when his brother, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Averdale, died. Prince George had been enjoying being in command of this particular little vessel and had enjoyed sailing her around and doing all sorts of interesting things in her. She was a good way of getting away. In July 1892 in Portsmouth, she carried out trials on machinery and equipment, following which she swung her compasses at Spithead and departed for Plymouth and Falmouth. In 1897, she was present at the Naval Review at Spithead for the Diamond Jubilee. It's amazing how many this class will put her. In March 1899 until May 1901, she was under the command of Captain Richard Nigel Gresley, which is a very interesting name. I can't think who he might have been connected to. And he was replaced in post by Captain Henry H. Dyke. In January 1901, she had a little accident and grounded. HMS Sibyl, as one of her sisters. Then, again, called upon for King Edward VII's review. It's amazing how many of these ships are called upon for reviews. They just look so good in line. They really do add to the overall ambience of the motif going on. And then she was sent to Sitoff Island, where she received the Japanese cruisers Asama and Takasonga to court. So basically, she was sat there to go, "Hello, welcome, I'm here to ensure you go where you're supposed to go," in a very friendly and nice manner. In 1903, she was withdrawn as the guard ship at Kingsdown in Ireland, and in 1910 she was sold for scrap for £9,000. A good little ship. Naid. Another good ship. Guess which review she took part in? I don't think I need to go and mention it. But in 1901, on the 19th of March, a very auspicious day, Captain Alexander Bethel was appointed a commander, and she was serving in the Mediterranean Fleet. She served off South Africa during the Second Boer War, and 117 of her crew served in naval brigades ashore in the Cape Colony. following year, she visited Alexandria and Port Said en route to Aden in late October 1902. Based in the Indian Sea, she was involved in military operations in Somaliland 1902-04. Her crew received 285 medals and clasps for their involvement in the campaign. That's a very decorated crew and a very useful ship. She was converted to a mine layer in 1910, as they were regarded by then as being obsolete in their primary role as a cruiser. She was relegated to harbour duties in 1919 after a very active war and doing a lot of interesting work involving mines. Mainly mines. Certainly mines. This is also Naid. Now, those of you who don't know, some of us have the joy of being in families which name their cars. My family has a habit of giving their cars very interesting names, and so I name my Subarus after cruisers, and my Volvos after capital ships. It seems appropriate. This was Naid, which it was 2 cars ago for me. But, you know, I thought I'd include her. She was very pretty, and she was a good Scooby. HMS Sappho. And the other option was the group who outnumber me dramatically in my family, the feminine gender, wanted to call her, well, there were various things of Swallow and Blue Jay were going around as potential names, so I decided definitely naming her Naid, which then caused more fun. We'll leave that to one side out. So, HMS Sappho, an Apollo-class cruiser. Who'd have thought in this video? Now, she spent most of her career being a very active colonial cruiser. In fact, pretty much from 1892 to 1918, she's almost inconsistent service. She was a troop ship during the Second Boer War. In 1901, she went aground while crossing the Durban Bar and had to be sent for repairs in the United Kingdom. She was escorted, actually, from Las Palmas by HMS Furious, well, the Furious at the time, arriving at Sheerness in August 1901, proceeding to Chatham for repairs the following day. In 1909, she was rounded by the Wilson Line steamer in thick fog of Dungeness and holed below the waterline, which flooded her engine room. She almost sunk. She was almost sunk, but was saved by the tugs and taken to Chatham for repair. She seems to like to go back to Chatham for repair, despite the fact that she was actually built by the Samuda brothers in Cubitt Town, London. I do, to an extent, wonder if she was spending so much time and so attracted to Chatham in order to get over the fact that she wasn't built by a proper cruiser yard, in her opinion. I'm not sure. I feel the Samuda brothers are perfectly good and respected construction facilities, so, you know, it's interesting. What shows the toughness of the design and the quality of her construction is the fact that despite having a very nearly 2.5 by 2 metre hole in her hull, the cruiser was actually repaired and able to return to service within 6 days. That's quality construction for you. In 1909, she's paid off for another refit and conversion to mine layer. In 1914, she's attached to the Grand Fleet and initially deployed on patrol purposes, operating northeast of Shetland in the early October 1914. The idea being that they would prevent German interference with a convoy carrying troops from Canada to England, and north of Orkney later that month to cover another convoy movement. She was eventually placed in charge, well, her commanding officer was, of 4 armed boarding steamers, which were tasked with patrolling the northwest of the Hebrides to stop merchant ships suspected of carrying contraband bound for Germany. There was recently a discussion about whether or not the German sailors from the Battle of Coronel, if the ships had been interred, could have got home en masse? My answer was no. Canaris managed to do it, but he was travelling solo and pretending to be South American, which he could do because he spoke Spanish fluently, and he was travelling solo. It's amazing what you can do when you're travelling solo. If you're travelling as a group, you'd stick out, and that would cause the governments to have to think about what they're going to do about you, and whether or not they notice you. And then, of course, there's more likelihood of the British hearing about it, and the British deciding to do something about it. And they have lots of ships wandering around, ready to do it. In May 1918, she was ordered to be scuttled in the mouth of Ostend harbour, and that's in Belgium, following the failed first Ostend raid. The second raid was intended to block the harbour and prevent German U-boats and other smaller craft from going from Bruges to the North Sea. However, whilst travelling from Dunkirk to Ostend on day of attack, she actually, for one of the first times in her life, suffered severe engine damage in a minor boiler explosion and was forced to retire. I think she decided she didn't want to be used in that way. She didn't want to be scuttled for those purposes. Didn't want the ignominy of that. She was not used again during the war and was scrapped in 1921. This was a ship which had been active her entire career. I didn't think she wanted such a passive end. Certainly didn't seem to suit her. Ah, well. Thetis. Now, she was... how do I put this? She was another ship which had an interesting life. Her first significant service was working with the US Navy on the Bering Sea Patrol to suppress poaching in the Bering Sea, where everyone knew where the poaching was coming from. But they all had to pretend that they didn't. And it was a masterstroke of naval diplomacy and operations, and she was an absolutely perfect vessel to have there. The Americans both couldn't claim to be threatened by her, but also she was big enough they couldn't really ignore her or bully her. She was at that sweet spot. You have great big armoured cruisers and large vessels. How could you claim to be threatened by a second-class cruiser? However, I am a second-class cruiser. I am not a patrol boat. And you will remember I am an HMS cruiser. Again, this is a form of deterrence. It's a form of conflict management and conflict prevention, which might seem strange. But again, it comes back to the fact that wars are usually caused by either greed or fear. Especially in the period of empires, but I have no doubt it is the same to this day. If you look weak, people will try and take advantage of you. If you let poaching go ahead and you do not send something out to deal with it, that will encourage others because they will think you are not interested. And for those who want to say, well, no, that's just a period of an old time, that never happens. One of the largest reasons why the Falklands War of 1982, which is 40 years ago, according to, let's see, where is it? Is it up here? I think it's up here. No, that's not that one. Ooh. My poppy's finally arrived. There we go. I think that's the right one, yes. This is a 40th anniversary Falklands conflict. Poppy. And it's quite a cool one. It's got the Falklands, a map of the Falklands on the back. But leaving that to one side, one of the main reasons it happened is because the South Atlantic Patrol Vessel, the Antarctic Patrol Vessel, British government announced they're getting rid of it. They're not going to replace it. Which sends the signal to the Argentinian government that Britain's not interested in the South Atlantic anymore. So, if they're not interested in the South Atlantic, they won't be interested in the Falklands. When you're dealing with a power which is going through an expansionist phase, which, let's be honest, considering what happens in 1899, you cannot say the Americans in the 1890s are not going through. You need to present a certain image. Fetus is that image. Now, under the command of then Captain W. Stoke Rees, she serves in Mediterranean Station until March 1901. She's then paid off in Chatham, placed in Fleet Reserve. In 1902, Captain Julian Charles Alex Wilkinson is appointed in command, and she's sent out with 273 officers and men for service on the China Station. The latter half of her career, like most of her siblings, involves her being a mine layer, and she was actually eventually sunk as a block ship in the attempts to block the canal in the Zeebrugge raid. First World War, April 1918. Again, she decided it was her duty to be a block ship. She decided, you weren't using me as a block ship. I have more status than that. This one went to her fate. HMS Brilliant. Well, again, so many of these names. Oh, good lord. So many of these names are reused so many times for different things. Now, Brilliant is particularly brilliant. Again, guess which review she takes part in? She does 2 big reviews. I can't think which pair she might end up in. After the Edward VII's review, she visited the Aegean with other ships of her squadron, took part in combined manoeuvres of the Mediterranean Fleet, and returned to Portsmouth in October. Later that year, she was sent back to Gibraltar for temporary service in the Mediterranean in order to protect British interests in Morocco, because there were various things going on there. There were Germans running around, there were French running around, and there were Moroccans running around, and all were looking a bit distressed. You know what it's like. There are issues. The local British diplomat says, can someone please come and wave the flag loudly? And the British go, if we send anything too big, it's going to look like we actually want to get involved. But if we send anything too small, it's going to look like we don't care what's going on, and they might all start acting really stupid. This is a problem. What shall we do? Apart from saying thank you for Iron Brew being back in stock. Send a second-class cruiser. In October 1914, together with her sister Sirius and several sloops and destroyers, she actually shelled German troops on the Belgian coast. She was part of the force which was stopping the Germans advancing down the Belgian coast. Brilliant was actually hit by return fire on the 28th October, which killed one of her crew and wounded several more. In November 1914, the torpedo gunboat Niger was torpedoed and sunk in the Downs by the German U-12. This was the first vessel such like that to be actually sunk by a German submarine. As a result, Hood, that's Horace Hood, commander of the Dover Patrol, and senior officer of Dover, decided Dover was no longer secure against submarine attack, and ordered Brilliant and Sirius to Sheerness to avoid the submarine hazard. He didn't see the point in these ships getting destroyed, when frankly he had better uses for them. While based at Sheerness, they served as guard ships against possible German attack. In June 1915, she was serving as a guard ship on the Tyne. On the night of the 15th and 16th of June, the German airship L-10 attacked targets on the Tyne, bombing, of course, Yarrow, Wallsend and South Shields. 18 were killed and 72 were wounded by L-10's bombs. Brilliant actually fired her guns at L-10, but the German airship was undamaged. And you can't really say you're surprised by that, because this ship doesn't really scream AA capable. But she was carrying 3-pounders, and they did try and do some... Let's put it this way. There were some chiefs who did some very interesting modifications to this ship. Very interesting modifications to this ship. In July 1917, she was based at Lerwick in Shetland as a depot ship for the vessels on the auxiliary patrol. And in April 1918, she was part of the force which was scuttled, part of the first Ostend raid. Again, in the nicest way, I do wonder if this was another point that went through Sappho's mind. You've already taken several of my sisters and failed to do this. So, yeah. Their wrecks were broken up post-war. They never made it into blocking position. The German countermeasures were just too effective. Indefatigable. The fact that there's Indefatigable, Intrepid and Infinia is just beautiful in this class to me. And she does look good. Look at this ship. It looks like it's got status. It might be a teeny titch, but it's a teeny titch with character. It's a corgi. It's small, but it doesn't know or understand the concept that it's small. That is actually a fairly good definition of a second-class protected cruiser. They're small, but they have no concept they are small. To them, they are the biggest dog in the room. To a properly designed second-class protected cruiser, they have no concept that they are the small vessel. To them, they are your equivalent, despite you being a mighty battleship. They have no concept of it. None at all. Now, Indefatigable was one of 10 ships of the class, which were actually sheathed in wood and copper in order to reduce fouling when serving in tropical waters. Yes, this was still going on. And basically how you protected the iron steel sort of hull was to sheathe it first in wood, and then sheathe the wood in copper. This would protect it. And by making sure you had a proper layer of wood between the iron and the copper, the steel and the copper, you would make sure you had the requisite protection to stop these things dissolving each other because of the joy of salt water and the interesting reaction it causes between various metals. An almost electrical reaction, one could say. Leaving that to one side. Now, she has an interesting service because you'd have thought with her reducing her service, wood and copper, and for service in tropical waters, she would immediately head out to the Far East or the Solaris. No, she goes to the North American West Indies Station, and they plan to have her there for a while. She's recommissioned at Bermuda in January 1900. She was in the port of Spain in 1902. Then she took part in the Anglo-German blockade of the coast of Venezuela. She's one of the vessels sent to Venezuela during the crisis of 1902 to 1903. Again, it's a second-class protected cruiser. It's there to make a point. Britain has a lot of these going around the world, and they're there to make a point that Britain has a lot of these going around the world. So please, everyone behave, because we have a lot of these going around the world. In 1905, she goes into reserve at Portsmouth before being recommissioned in January 1906 as part of 4th Cruiser Squadron, again for the North American West Indies Station. In 1910, she's renamed Melphamen, freeing up the name Indefatigable for a new battlecruiser because Fisher was going, okay, I love this ship, but there is no way I'm leaving that name for when I can use it for a battlecruiser. It seriously. In 1912, she was active off the coast of Mexico during the Mexican Revolution, and was capable of, well, had a fully loaded with Marines and sailors armed with rifles to be able to land and to protect British subjects should it be necessary. Melphine was then part of the training squadron from 1912 to 1913, and she actually goes to the shipbreakers in October 1913. This is because she's pretty much been used to death. Okay? She's been in service for roughly 22 years, pretty much constantly. Despite the best efforts to protect her, she has been used hard. She has gone through heavy seas. She has done days, weeks, months of patrol. Her hull is worn as any hull can be. Her machinery is worn. In 1913, the options are given if you are going to convert this ship into a mine layer, like you have some of her sisters, you are going to have to rebuild her entire engines. Because she has been used so much. It's considered more cost effective to get rid of the ship and build a new one. But it's considered cheaper. She deserved her name, though. Intrepid. Okay, so she's laid down in September 1889, launched in June 1891, and commissioned November 1892. During 1896 to 99, she served on North American West Indian Station. Then in 1899, just before the Spanish-American War broke out, she returns to Portsmouth. After refit, she returned to service in March 1900, and she's placed in the Fleet Reserve at Portsmouth. In 1902, she's sent for service in Mediterranean Station. She visits Plymouth and Gibraltar en route before reaching Malta in October 1902. Between October 1902 and 1904, she does port visits, takes part in manoeuvres. And in fact, in late 1902, she's at Port Said when her crew provided naval guard for the Duke and Duchess of Connaught as they visited the city in December, en route to India. In 1904, she was back at Portsmouth, and she'd still harbour service there until 1909. Then, she was converted at Chatham Dockyard into a mine layer, capable of carrying 100 mines. Each ship is slightly different in terms of how many they seem to carry. It's north of 80. The highest figure I've seen is 110. I have this sinking feeling it's to do with the deck strength, the strength of the steel and iron on the decks. And I know I keep calling it sort of iron and steel rather than they're not iron-hulled ships, they are steel-hulled ships, but the steel is a very early form of steel in terms of marine steel and marine quality steel, which is why it behaves to an extent closer to what we would consider iron more than steel in some regards. Now, I've only read about this in one of my dad's naval architecture books, and to be honest, I read about it a while ago, and I've got to get his books out of the boxes they're in and set them up properly to go through it in detail. But these ships are a very interesting construction, and each one has a slightly different construction. It's not quite standardized yet when these are going into construction. By the time you get to 1900, steel is being produced in far greater quantities and to a far greater standardization. But in the 1890s, there is still a lot of I wouldn't say in precision, I would say artistic flair in the maker's hearts. That's how I describe it. Artistic flair. In 1910, she recommissions. Now, as part of her taking on the 100 mines, her armament is reduced down to 4.7-inch guns. It makes sense. She's based at Dover, supporting the Dover Patrol and providing them with a mine layer. Between 1915 and 1916, she serves as a depot ship in North Russia. In 1917, she's transferred into the White Sea to support the North Russian Squadron. And then, along with Infanina and Thetis, she's selected to be a block ship during the Zeebrugge raid. To prepare for the raid, she was actually filled with cement, as they were. And she was sunk at the entrance to the Bruges Canal to try and prevent it being used by German U-boats. They didn't really manage to get close enough to block. That's the trouble. They didn't get close enough to block. Infanina. That is a good looking ship. That's a ship with serious intent. If it turns up to look at you, you know, I have things bigger than you, but, yeah. They use you like I use patrol ships. That's worrying. That is worrying. Now, she spent most of her time on the China station. And she takes part in pretty much everything you can imagine on the China station between her commissioning in 1893, her first commissioning, and 1906. If anything goes down on the China station, she's there. She's actually one of the first also to be converted into a mine layer. She's one of the first ones to do so in 1907. And as said, the ships seem to change as to what sort of mines, and also it might be the number of mines they're carrying might be to do with the size of mines available at the time of which they're converted. Because it seems as it goes longer, their numbers get lesser. And I do wonder if the mines, I do know the mines are getting heavier, and I'm wondering if that's, well, they could carry 110 of this type of mine, but 80 of this type of mine, sort of thing. And as mentioned, she's used as a block ship. As a Zeebrugge. It's such a waste. It really is such a waste. Such good looking ships. Rainbow. Now, Rainbow is another special one, and she has a very special career. Well, she does. She is the sort of vessel which is, I don't know how to put this, critical to the existence of the Canadian Navy, I would argue. At the outbreak of the First World War, she's actually considered the only major Commonwealth warship on the western coast of North America. If Von Spee had gone north, this is the ship that would have met him. Think about that. She served on the China station, mainly operating from Hong Kong between 1895 and to 1898. She served the Mediterranean, 1898 to 1999. Her operating costs were deemed excessive between 1900 and 1909. I'm not quite so sure why, considering she's pretty much the same as her other class. But I'm thinking that was an excuse to not use her. And why do I say that's an excuse to not use her? They're using the sisters of the class. They're using everyone. So for her to be deemed excessive versus the others, I think it's more a case of, we have enough of these in service, we'd rather like them, we're going to keep a few of them doing not much so they're available for other things if we want them to. And during that time, she actually did serve as an additional ship in home waters and for various exercises. So that's another thing. She sees very little service between 1900 and 1909, but she takes part in a lot of exercises, does a lot of work in home waters, and even wanders around the Mediterranean in 1902. And of course, takes part in a certain review for Edward VII in 1902. She has fun. In 1909, she's decommissioned and placed on the inactive list, again due to her operating costs. And this makes me think that perhaps there were differences in her engines, perhaps they used more coal. She certainly has the same crew as the rest of the ship, so whatever's affecting her operating costs has got to be something which is not a standardized system. So engines are one of the few systems which, whilst they're theoretically standardized, aren't really standardized at this time. That can seriously affect operating costs. However, she's then presented in 1910 to the Canadians, recommissioned as HMCS Rainbow, and she and HMS Niobe, which of course was a Diadem class protected cruiser, were purchased to be training ships for the Royal Navy College at Canada in Halifax. Here is the actual interesting thing. The reason the Admiralty believed the Apollo class cruiser to be the right choice for Canada was actually their efficiency in cost-effective operations. And Canada were very careful to be sure that they were getting a cost-effective operational ship, which again leads me to think that the ship had been, the cost of running it has been overblown at some point. They used money from the Marine and Fisheries Department, which was outstanding, and paid 225,000 Canadian dollars to acquire Rainbow. The ships had alterations to make them suitable for training. This required that they be fitted with, well, with an up-to-date galley, the latest in Marconi wireless, enlargement of cadet gunroom and principal messes, and the removal of the obsolete secondary armament, which I think mostly relates to the 6-pounders. She's then assigned to the west coast of Canada, and is the first Canadian ship to sail around South America by the Straits of Magellan. Now, after she commissioned, the fact that they were able to operate without direction from the Admiralty meant that these Canadian vessels were kept the ships within coastal waters. They might have long-range radios, but these are the first ships the Canadian governments had that are warships that they can send where they want to go. And they do have issues with a certain neighbour to the south who keeps doing weird things. This meant Rainbow spent most of her life on fisheries patrols. Well, for the first part of her naval life as a Canadian vessel. Pardon me. In 1911, she had, as mentioned, her guns changed around, the 6-pounder guns removed, and these are replaced with 12-pounder naval guns. Surprising enough, her service on the west coast was quiet, barring coastal fishery patrols, where she apprehended vessels like the American fishing schooner Edry in February 1913 for illegal fishing. When Niobe was laid up in 1913, her crew was sent west to enhance Rainbow's complement. In 1914, she was sent to Vancouver to assist with the international incident that was, at that time, taking place. The Kamangata Maru, a Japanese merchant vessel, which was filled to the brim with Sikh immigrants from Canada, Sikh immigrants from India, was challenging Canada's immigration law, which had been designed to prevent immigration from South Asia. The ship's passengers were British subjects. However, they were not being allowed to disembark even though they were. And so the ship had sat in Vancouver Harbour for 2 months. Local authorities had refused various attempts by the government to make the ship leave. Basically, central government was going, get rid of them, get rid of them. And the local authorities were going, nah, we don't feel like it. So Rainbow was ordered to intervene in order to do so. They turned up, they had discussion with the passengers. The passengers had taken over the vessel. Those aboard the Kamangata Maru, therefore, after discussions, agreed to leave Vancouver only when supplies for the ship were provided. They sailed from Vancouver on the 23rd of July, escorted by Rainbow. Sadly enough, 20 of the passengers were actually killed upon returning to Budge in India. They resisted an attempt to forcibly return them to the Punjab. And, well, yeah, 20 of the passengers were killed. It's not a great time. The ship and crew equipped themselves with honour and with definitely decorum in a very difficult circumstance, fulfilling duties that the government requested of them, as unpalatable as they might have been for some. When the First World War broke out, well, she sent to cover the withdrawal of the British troops Shearwater and Altreen, which had been doing things out on the coast of Mexico. She was the largest armed ship of the Allies in the Western Pacific. And she was ordered to actually engage ships of the Imperial German Navy if they turned up in her area, especially the light cruisers SMS Leipzig and SMS Nuremberg, which it was felt that she could take. Thank God she managed to miss Leipzig by a day at San Francisco. She was the only source of protection until the Izumo, the Japanese armoured cruiser, arrived. She would stay there pretty much till constant patrolling for most of the rest of the war. She was felt to be a match for all but the fastest of German raiders, although at various points her patrols were shortened due to lack of a collier to refuel her when she was on patrol. In 1916, she was patrolling the west coast of North America and looking out for German shipping. And in April, she managed to seize the German-owned, but this is important, American-flagged schooner Oregon. Then followed it up by seizing the Mexican-flagged schooner Leonor on the 2nd of May. She returned to Eskimo with the prize in tow on the 30th of May. The British doing what the British do, even if they're Canadian in this case. In 1916 and 1917, she was used to transport $140 million in Russian gold. That's valued in 1917 Canadian dollars, between Eskimo and Vancouver. This was placed in trust with Canada by the Russian government for protection due to the worries about the potential of a revolution in Russia. In 1918, the RCN decided that the cost of operating Rainbow was using up too much of the West Coast Naval Operations budget. and Rainbow's crew were needed for the fight against the U-boats, which is probably the more important thing. It's not so much supplying the ship with coal, it's the crew who are trained, well experienced sailors and officers who you could be using for. So she's decommissioned in May 1917, crew sent east. She's recommissioned Eskimo as a depot ship, and she serves in this role till June 1920, when she's sold for scrap to a Seattle shipbroker. I don't know. Sirius. A good ship. She spent, again, quite a lot of her career on the China station. And then part of the training squadron, from 1912. She was, well, how do I put it? She was part of a number of ships who took part in the Battle of Yser, supporting Belgian troops, and then served as part of Nord Command from 1914 to March 1915, being used as a guard ship on the east coast of the UK. She's then sent to serve off West Africa, where she remains on station until 1918. In April 19, of course, she's one of those vessels which is actually used in the first Ostend raid. But, as mentioned with Brilliant, they are both destroyed by their crews outside the harbour mouth after running aground on a sandbank. They don't actually make it in as far as those boats need to go. But she's a good vessel, and she's one of the ones built by Armstrong at Ellswick. And Spartan. Now, she's fun. Well, she comes out of construction, and she's used for various little sort of testing and things in the Mediterranean, etc. And then in 1899, she's given a refit and then placed in A Division of the Fleet Devonport Fleet Reserve. In 1907, she's put on harbour duty, and in 1921, she becomes part of the Royal Navy Torpedo School at Devonport, HMS Defiance. Her career, well, how do I put this politely? Her career is special. She does absolutely nothing that we would consider noteworthy or in terms of historical writing. In simple puts, she does nothing which historians would write a book about. However, she is in service with the Royal Navy in one form or another from 1891 to 1931. Her hull provides service for 40 years. She serves as a ship of the fleet for 30 of those years through a world war. She is used for numerous tasks, sometimes frontline duties earlier in her career, or rather frontline peacetime duties, sometimes not so frontline duties. She's a good ship, and a useful one. Other members of the class which I haven't really gone into detail of because they've got even less written about them than Spartan, and I'm honestly not sure what happened to some of them. It gets very confused. Scylla, Sybil, which I have mentioned, Terpsichore, Tribune, Aeolus, Peak, and Retribution. All have done interesting things, I'm sure, and were wandering around the world. But the thing is, when it says this vessel, which is named, so I've talked about it, and other sisters of her class, it doesn't tell me what those other sisters of the class were. I can have an educated guess, but I'm not 100% sure. So how useful were they? How useful were they? Incredibly. There's a very sensible discussion which goes on about to what extent these vessels improvement over marathon class cruisers, to what extent were they this, that. These vessels are Britain finding a very good balance that serves as that balancing role for a good decade and a half. For about 15 years, they are the perfect point of second class protected cruiser. Yes, they are slowly pushed down the level of second class protected cruiser. Slowly, ever more armoured ships, ever more powerfully equipped ships come into service. But they still are second class cruisers. And the thing is, there's enough of them to be useful, especially as training ships. Look at the list of officers I've given that go on to higher roles and more important functions that earned their standards fighting in these ships, working in these ships. You see, you used to have a vessel of sloops, or equivalent, patrol vessels. They're where you test out whether an officer can actually command a ship. Where an officer can actually lead a crew. There isn't much they can muck up. There's not going to be a major situation where they are going to get too involved in things that they are going to cause much trouble. So that's all about your ship handling. But these ships, no, command of these ships are about something much more than ship handling. These are about command, as in a Royal Navy captain. These are about, are you going to be able to stand up on the world stage and represent Great Britain? Which can sound a strange thing, but it's an important thing to remember. A ship's captain, especially in the age of, well, this period when we're talking about where there is no global communications net, where information does not really spread as quickly as it can do. Where a captain is often on their own, with no person to call up. These represent the ships where you have actual military power. Where you have actual significance as a combatant. You are actually a valuable part of the fleet. And ergo, it's unsurprising that officers who are sent to these ships early in their career to be tested out are often officers who go on to senior command. Because if you do well then we can give you something bigger and better. And if you do well there, we can send you on to even bigger and better things. We often talk about the things that fleets are missing today. To an extent, a large chunk of their diplomatic role has disappeared because of the ease of one-to-one communications. Now, national leaders can ring up each other and have a conversation one-on-one over the phone with seconds. They can video conference if they want. The role of second-class protected cruiser, therefore, is to an extent moot. But I think you still need them. I think you still need that balance of ship, and this class were very good at that, of a vessel which can provide you with a first-line combatant in that you're happy to take into war and fight off against opponents, but is cheap enough and therefore probably not first line, but maybe first line beta, this is a proper definition, that you can build in quantity. And I go back to this. $29 second-class cruisers. $29 of them. That's useful. Quantity is a quality all of its own, and they gave quality. But more importantly, they gave quantity. So what have we got coming up? Ooh. Well, when this video comes out, the Sveldov class is tomorrow. So, hope you're looking forward to that. And, of course, the modified Apollos that came after them were the Estrella class. And I thought I'd quickly sort of mention them and discuss them a bit. You can look and you can see what are the differences. Got an Apollo class up on the top right of the screen. Estrella class in bottom left. As you can see, the Estrella class carries more firepower. It's slightly bigger, slightly longer. It's slightly more powerful. It's also bulged out its fore and aft 4.7-inch guns to give them just that bit more firepower in terms of where they're able to fire. They're also carrying 10 6-pounders, a 3-pounder, and 4 18-inch torpedo tubes rather than 14-inch. So they are a far more heavily loaded vessel. Again, they came with some interesting names: Astrea, Bonaventure, Cambrian, Chabitis, Flora, Forte, Fox and Hermione. And they provided the Royal Navy with more good service. Again, these are ships which you are even less likely to want to bump into as a second-class protected cruiser. You would probably win if you were anything bigger, but what you'd win would be damage. It's one of those cases. It is a risk fleet theory. It's, again, one of those interesting things. Risk fleet is associated with turpits and all those on that side. But to be honest, the British have been practicing it for a lot longer. It's just the British version of the risk fleet is this. It's these presence vessels around the world. They have enough firepower and enough armour that you're not going to sink them easily, but they are able to be built in enough numbers, and they are cheap enough and probably not going to overwhelm you, that they can be built in numbers necessary to be in the places they need them to be. It's a complicated balancing act, but the British do it. And what have we got coming up? Ooh, we have our own use of water-based armour, which annoyed King so much. And ooh, we've got, of course, got the Commerce class coming up, and the Calypso class. They're going to be fun. Continuations of the ideas. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoyed this series. As said, this is more of the 19th century cruisers, so yeah, hope you enjoy. Take care. Thank you, and have a nice day. Bye. Oh, and question, and this is just if you fancy a question at the end. What is the modern equivalent of a second-class protected cruiser? What is the modern equivalent of a vessel which is powerful enough that people can't ignore it, and it could be part of a first-line fleet, yet is cheap enough and simple enough to be built in numbers that you need it for presence? And I know I gave it sort of set away. I talked about the Constellation class and the plans for them, and I said that's a pretty simple an idea of what I think a second-class protected cruiser is, and all the Hazard Perrys. So, whilst I will accept those as submissions, I prefer it if you come with your own. Take care, have fun, and thank you for watching. Oh, and please again, please help me with the joyous issue that is the mother-aunt bet that's going on. If you've watched other videos of mine, you'll know. Once again, it's approaching Christmas. Once again, it's approaching a scenario where my mother and aunt have a bet going on, and it's what our family do. We make bets on things, and there is a bet going back and forth whether or not I reach 10,000 subscribers by Christmas. If I do, my aunt has to give my mum something, and if I don't, my mum has to give my aunt something. I think it's a baked cake. It's not a massive thing, but please, mainly from the perspective of I just want my mum to win. If you like the videos, please subscribe and share. It really helps. Thanks very much and take care. Bye.